short discussion. We are late, and probably we started later than 3:30. I would allow us to have at least 10-15 minutes if you are not in a hurry to take advantage of this exceptionally diverse and qualified panelists in order to to investigate a little bit more the issues that they have raised in different ways. So, is there any question we can start with? They have provided us with a lot of data, for instance, figures, that in the previous panels were available but not so much. Here there is an issue, whether or not the creators are fairly remunerated. As you might have noticed, I will have a question myself for the panelists. First of all, the front of right holders is not united in the sense that, as David raised very clearly, there is an issue of fairness on the right holder front, in the sense that there is a tension between the content owners, those who acquire content and creations, the rights at least, from the original right holders, the authors, and then there is an issue that is the issue that fundamentally raised by Victor, of the lack of compensation and excessively generous liability exemption that stems from the e-commerce directive that was adopted at a time when intermediaries were not the intermediaries of today, no? And Mira instead emphasized the fact that in spite of the plethora of directives that we have had in the last 20 years in the field of copyright, there has been no directive, with very, very narrow exceptions, that has dealt with the issue of fair contractual relationship. And the directives that could actually target the issue of the different bargaining powers that exists in the on the copyright holders' fronts. So a question I have for Victor is, how do you see the implementation of the directive of 2014? How do you see the impact of this directive on collective rights management organizations? Because here in Ireland, the history of performing rights organizations, and in particular the music one, is I would say a successful history, in the sense that at the end the discontent is not very much with the way rights have been collectively managed, but at this time is very much about the contentious issue of liability online. I come, for instance, from Italy, where the equivalent of IMRO in Italy is, first of all, has a different governance system, has been heavily influenced by politics, heavily. A couple of times, in the same way as the Spanish society, actually the bodies themselves were not able to elect their management, and there was an intervention of political authorities in appointing the managers for a limited time, like commissioners they were called. So that there was a discontent that referred to the way this society is operated in crucially important jurisdictions of Europe, because again, this workshop has been careful about Ireland, but also about Europe, because of the digital single market, which is a reality. So my question is, how do you see this directive, the impact of this directive, not only from your perspective as the Irish player in this sector, but with regard to your sister societies?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say in relation to the directive, we were one of the few societies around Europe who actively campaigned for the introduction of the directive, because we weren't happy with the transparency and accountability of some of the practices, it's fair to say, that were prevalent 10-15 years ago around Europe. And we weren't shy about saying that. We're on record in the Commission in saying that. So we welcome the directive. We don't think the directive went far enough in some cases. For example, we think the fact that you have to distribute, I think they settled on within 9 months of receiving the monies. I think that's in 2016, it's simply not good enough. We should be distributing within a quarter of getting the monies, if not within the end of the month of getting the royalties and monies. So in some respects it didn't go far enough. But look, in IMRO's case, we have We expect to have to make very few changes to our constitution in order to fully comply with the directive. We haven't seen the Irish legislation yet. Unfortunately, the Irish legislation is going to be late again. If not late, it's going to be simply published in mid-April, right at the deadline. So we won't see it, and we don't know in relation to the options that are available to the Irish government. We don't know what options they're taking at the moment. So it's actually difficult to comment on it, but from what we know of the directive, we don't have much to implement in relation to it. But in some respects it would have gone further. We'd like to see it going further.
And with regard, for instance, very briefly, to what Alan Bargfrede remarked from the US with regard to the development of these technologies that will help you provide your members with a detailed and transparent way of calculating revenue. Are you optimistic? Because Alan mentioned, for instance, the failure of the global repertoire database. How much is your sector of business, so the management sector, relying on technology in order to make the...
No matter what way we look at it and what we like to think we're in the collection societies, the music collection societies, we are data processors, no matter what way we look at it. So IT is absolutely vital to us. In terms of how we operate, we're data processors. And we have to accept and acknowledge that. I think there's an awful long way to go still in doing in establishing centralized databases. There's been at least 3 attempts in the last 15 years. There's been a hell of a lot more than 15 million euros spent on it over the last 15 years trying to get global databases of one description or another. I know CSAC, the umbrella body of collection society globally, are still working on fast track and other issues to try and get proper global databases. There are also initiatives going around in Europe, and you have ICE and the hubs between the UK, Sweden and Germany. Yeah. That's a positive development, and it's something we're obviously monitoring closely as well. We will cooperate, IMRO from its perspective will cooperate with any sister society or number of societies that will allow us to do our job more efficiently and allow us to be as absolutely transparent as we can be. We break down our distributions by, if you have a track played on radio in Kildare 2 weeks ago at 3:20 in the afternoon, you'll get that on a statement, 3.5 minutes played on Kildare radio. So that's the level of detail you get, and we would like to see that level of detail in relation to all of the uses in online as well, but it's very difficult because we're being forced into signing unbelievable non-disclosure agreements in relation to online providers, and yet for people who are using copyrights on a national basis, in Ireland, we have to publish the schemes so we know exactly what everybody is paying. I can't see why, in the online world, that we can't publish the licensing schemes that we're being forced to sign.
Thanks a lot. Is there any question? Because I would like to ask David one thing, because he's following the debate in Brussels. You know that the European Commission came out with this proposal for a regulation concerning the portability of services, which is, as I said in my intervention, a very modest thing in my view, but something bigger is in preparation. So there will be a directive proposal. It's very likely in 2016, even though the contents of this directive are still, mysterious. Nobody knows. Even though we can assume that certain things will be incorporated in the proposal, reading also the communication of December 2015. But I'm curious to ask David if there is anything that is interesting purely from an author perspective in the proposal that the Commission might come out with in the next months.
It's always a mistake to be optimistic when you're working with the Commission. It's just a foolish way to go. But insofar as one can retain a sense of optimism, I think there is some possible reasons for optimism. There will be a directive apparently in July. They're starting already on the impact assessment, which is one of the key background documents they have to make, and the most complex one, and they write the impact assessment before an impact can be seen, but that's the way it works. And they're considering 3 possible proposals in respect of authors' remuneration, which have different levels of support. One is an idea proposed by the collective management organisations in the audiovisual in Europe, which is for an unwaivable right to remuneration for online uses paid by the final user and managed by the CMOs. Equitable remuneration is the phrase that they're using on it, and it has been picked up by the Commission to some degree. The Commission's not, at the level that's looking at this, are not deeply enthusiastic about collective management, and we're not sure how that will come. They're fascinated by a new concept which came from GSAC, also a collection of an organisation collecting societies with music collecting societies involved in it, which is going under the heading of the transfer of value. And this is the idea that within the industry overall, value has moved from one place to the other, and it's moved now to the online environment in particular, and to the OSPs and ISPs in particular, and that this needs to be corrected. And they seem to be prepared to re-examine the making available right in some detail, but not to reopen the e-commerce directive to look at the safe harbour provisions. And there may be that something interesting will come out of that. We're focused on the moment on the hope that, is that me? It is, I think. That's my phone up there.
Someone from Brussels, maybe.
It is actually. The third one that we're very interested in is, and I go to what Mira was saying about German and Dutch law. We think that there is a distinct possibility that they will look at what's called the bestseller clause in German law and in Dutch law, which we're now putting under the terms of fairness. In other words, the idea is that if you're entitled to fair or extra remuneration, and the thing that you wrote or painted or whatever earns an income significantly in excess of what was anticipated, you can revisit the contract and renegotiate your rate. They seem to be interested in the possibility of that because it has extraordinary knock-on effects. You can't have a fairness or fair remuneration clause unless there is transparency of information about what is happening with your product as it goes through the value chain. And the Commission is fascinated with the concept of transparency in the value chain. So we are mildly optimistic.
Mira, do you have any comment about what might happen in Brussels? And it seems that finally the European Commission is realizing that if the copyright system doesn't effectively protect the authors, there is also a lack of credibility of the whole copyright system. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the can you hear me? Yes, okay. I think the expression that was just used, David was saying it's better not to be optimistic, but he's sort of feeling mildly optimistic. I mean, I think I would probably share that sentiment. But the fact of the matter is we've been talking intensively about copyright ever since the onset of the digital era, so about 15 years. And sort of during that entire time, there's been virtually no mention of authorship. But at the same time, it's true that organizations like David's and IMRO and so on have been working towards making their voices heard on behalf of authors. There's always been some population, at least small, of advocates for authors and artists. I think because the unfairness of what happens to them is something so striking that there's always some advocacy on their behalf that's inspired by what we see. So perhaps in that sense, this constituency is starting to be a little bit influential, and so we can expect some sort of small changes in positive directions towards a better situation for authors and artists. But I think we have to recognize that, you know, this problem is one that exists pretty much since time immemorial. You know, life has never been easy for authors and artists. There's never been a perfect system in place in order to ensure that their position in society is the one that they might deserve. And so this is a sort of challenge that society has always faced. It's just that in the modern era, we've moved into a situation where we depend on copyright law as our primary mechanism for providing economic support to authors. So once the copyright system fails, they're essentially left with nothing. And for example, if you were to dig a bit deeper into the report from the Writers' Union of Canada, one thing they analyze is how much of the author's earning actually comes from copyright royalties, and it's a very significant part. I mean, it's upwards of 60%. So I think for all of these reasons, we can expect a little bit of change slowly, but there isn't going to be a seismic shift suddenly where everyone suddenly embraces the idea that, you know, authors need a better deal and we've got to do something dramatic. That's just not how things work, as David has repeatedly illustrated in his comments. But at least, let's say some mild optimism might be in order, because we've been talking about this for a long time and we're due for some positive change.